It's a big room, so I apologize. I also apologize profusely on behalf of my co-moderator, Charles Duhigg. Those of you who are expecting to see Charles, hoping to see Charles, only here because you wanted to see Charles, I won't take it personally. If you're, you can file out now. I'll just make sure to tweet about you. So what Charles and I've sort of downloaded part of his brain. I've downloaded the parts of other colleagues of mine's brains that I will get to as we go here. The goal here is to have a discussion, almost a workshop, not quite a workshop, because we're not going to actually harass anyone here. You're more than welcome, and in fact encouraged, to harass me, since I'm the sort of figure of authority in the front of the room, I suppose. But I want to somehow go, get between a discussion and a workshop about how to actually go out and get people to say things, either that they don't want you to know, or that they wish they hadn't said, but are actually true and revealing, or some version of that. And the way that Charles and I sort of broke this up was based on the kinds of work that he and I each do. Charles, as you know, is an award-winning reporter at the New York Times. And the reason, I should have said this before, the reason he is not here is because he has one of his mammoth, terrific projects dropping in the Sunday paper. So those of you who are around here Sunday will see it, if you're not, or Saturday night, I guess, probably online. And that'll explain why he's not here. I don't know very much about the project. They tend to keep these things under wraps until they drop. But because of that, he was unable to come. He's very sorry about that, and he will apparently be here tomorrow night. So if you want to razz him about it, or just actually say hello to him, maybe after a drink he'll tell you what Sunday's project's about. So what I do, I co-founded a blog called Retraction Watch with Adam Marcus, and Charlie being at the New York Times, we come at it from a little slightly different point of view. I tend to sort of use what I refer to as informal methods of investigation and harassment, while Charlie focuses more on more formal as well as the informal. So there we're really talking about filing Freedom of Information Act requests, FOIA requests, and I'm going to get into that. So what I'm going to kind of do to give you just a little bit of a schedule and agenda here is start off talking about some very specific cases, giving you some tips along the way, and some very specific cases of stuff that Adam and I have managed to uncover at Retraction Watch. Also a little bit at Embargo Watch, actually. That's my other blog, and some of these examples from there. And then talk about FOIA with the help. I'm very grateful for the help at the last minute. Charlie sent some notes, and also basically about half the board of directors of the Association of Healthcare Journalists sent me their thoughts, and those are all available up here on the wiki. And if you either want to follow along or just go back later to look at a lot of the links that I'm going to put up here, it's all on the wiki for Science Online. So, without any further ado, the big picture in terms of trying to get stuff that nobody wants you to know, and that was, I think, Paul Rayburn's sort of definition of what investigative journalism is, now that we have to label it. In the session this morning, he said if he were to separate the world into sort of investigative and non-investigative, that's how he would do it. One of the things you have to do, and this is why I think a lot of people get frustrated early on, is you have to establish credibility. You have to, people have to trust you. And this is true no matter what you're doing in life, obviously. It's true no matter what you're doing in journalism or blogging or writing about anything. You have to show that you are trustworthy with the information that someone's about to give you. Now, they may have an agenda, in which case they care less about whether you're trustworthy, they just want to get it out. But sometimes that information is quite sensitive. Now, how do you actually establish that credibility? Well, and this is one of those catch-22s, I guess, but you have to have a track record. So expecting to uncover lots of stuff that nobody wants you to talk about and publish the first day out or the first week out or even the first month out, that's probably a bit unrealistic. Okay, establish yourself, whether you're blogging, whether you're writing for whomever, as a serious person who, when confronted with facts, deals with those facts in an appropriate way. When confronted with allegations about someone, deals with those allegations in an appropriate way. That means checking them out. There are many first rules of journalism, and one of them is if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Okay? And that's not only because, by the way, most mothers of journalists hate the fact that their kids have gone into journalism. It's actually because you have to check things out even if they seem like they make sense. And often, it's the stuff that seems intuitive and that seems like common sense that when you overturn it, you suddenly realize that there's much more of a story there. So you've got to establish credibility. You've got to establish that you're serious about this. Taking potshots at people. You know, Adam and I grapple with this all the time. It's very tempting when someone has obviously done something wrong to really ridicule them. And we do certainly ridicule people periodically. But if you do too much of that, and if you do it without having at least given them the chance to give their, their version of events, or giving them a chance to speak, that's going to come back and bite you in the behind, because it's too easy for them to write you off. Remember, a lot of this becomes political, unfortunately. Don't give people an opportunity to write you off. So, in terms of establishing credibility, and also in terms of establishing sources, I think that one of the things that gets lost, and actually at least two, I don't see any others, but two of my just graduated students from Sherpa here at NYU, and they know we had a pretty rich conversation, I think, one of the last couple of classes, about establishing sources, and establishing relationships in general. That goes for establishing relationships with people who might hire you when you're doing whatever kind of work you're doing, but also with sources. Again, you're not going to get great material if you just are only calling, because something bad happened all the time. That doesn't mean you have to write puff pieces about what wonderful things happen. But, for example, I just got off the phone during the break here with, let's just say that this person is a very senior official at a publishing company that you've all heard of. He and I talk periodically. We have free-ranging conversations, the vast majority of which will never get into print. But when I need something from this person, even if it makes his or her company look incredibly bad, I get it. And I may get a spin on it, but I get it. And that leads me to this sort of notion of understanding what all these potentially very confusing terms are. I included in the wiki a piece. It's kind of amusing in its own way, because it's about the Clinton administration. Anybody remember Bill Clinton? He was our president. So the details of that particular case are interesting and sort of puerile, but not worth getting into. The reason I sent this piece around is because it actually gets into some of these descriptions of conversations and how much and what you can use for information. And if you poll journalists on what background means, or this concept which was introduced here called deep background, which no one is really sure what the hell that means, off the record, not for attribution. Not for attribution is actually pretty clear. But most of them you'll get 5 different answers, which is exactly what Slate got when they talked to 5 different Washington Post reporters. And that's what you would expect. And so I'm not here to sit and tell you, I think the piece is worth reading so you can be familiar with the arguments. I'm not going to sit here and tell you this is what this means, this is what that means. But understand, especially when you're talking with someone who, and a lot of the kinds of people, by the way, that you will want information from, and have the kind of information you want that isn't out there in the public, are going to be very familiar with these terms. And they're going to talk in terms of them. And it's very important to understand what they mean. So if someone says, on background, okay, you can sort of have an understanding what that means. And generally speaking, it means that there's a bit of information that if you go correlate it with somebody else who will say it on the record, right? So on the record it's what I am right now being filmed. I won't make a comment about other issues about embargoes and things, but you're on the record. That's the assumption if a reporter calls you. Okay. On background, what does that mean? And again, it means if someone else on the record can confirm this fact, okay, yes, this thing happened, then you can use that information. But better than just saying, well, is this on background, or is it on deep background, or is it, on background on Pluto? Rather than sort of worry about that, okay, have an understanding with your source about what you're using this information for, and under what circumstances you can use it. And that's where not for attribution, for example, comes in. So if you are solid with your source, you have an understanding of this person, and they say this is true, I'll vouch for it, and you believe that person because of your history with that person. But you can't attribute it to me. You then can sort of negotiate. Well, I can't attribute it to you. Can I attribute it to somebody else? I don't mean, can I attribute it to somebody else? Can I attribute it to somebody? Can I attribute it to the person you are, or the position you have? This is where you see a lot of, senior White House official stuff, senior Pentagon official, etc. A person familiar with the situation, which always, I totally know why reporters use that, but that could describe absolutely anyone. It could describe the report. Hopefully it does describe the report. A person close to the investigation, that sort of, again, gives you some credibility. But again, I'm not here to sort of define these terms, but I think it's important to understand that they describe a real phenomenon. They describe a relationship between you and that information and how you can use it. So how does this actually pay off in terms of establishing credibility? Yeah, and please, by the way, interrupt. I feel like I'm talking too much. I'm going to go through some stuff.
I can rely on what I learned in grade school, what deep background is supposed to be, I think. There's some details that if you let people know that you even know them, they can figure out who told you that information. So deep background is information you can't even let other people you ask know that you know. You can ask questions and, if you heard that, again, the Pentagon's going to get blown up, right? They're only and they're 5 terrorist members, this. They'll figure out, who told them. So you can ask people, do you have plans? Do they have explosives? You can work around it, but that way you don't disclose that you know this information. And therefore you don't hurt your source by letting them know that you were given this information.
Absolutely. So again, how is the relationship with you, between you and the source, sort of circumscribed? How is the relationship with you and the information circumscribed, and what might this information getting out mean for certain people? Again, not to get into the ethics of anonymous sourcing, I think that, and I think it's important to always think about. But anonymous sourcing that protects powerful figures, to me, is less of a compelling ethical case than something that protects less powerful figures. So in science, I'm going to work really hard to protect someone vulnerable, like the lowest person, in the totem pole in the lab. A graduate student, an undergraduate, a postdoc. When a PI comes to me with something that is painting someone else in an unflattering light, that person has power, they have control. I'm going to think about, whether it's worth doing that. Because my ultimate responsibility is my readers, not to my source. Sure.
Yeah, in my experience when I'm dealing with people who are not media savvy at all, and they're coming to you with information they want to trust you with, is to go over backwards to explain to them what it means when I publish what you told me. And even if at risk of them saying, well, I can't give that on the record yet, but still it's going to, you have to get it out front first, because it's worse to find out later that you're going to hurt them if it comes out.
Yeah, better to lose a potential story every now and then and actually develop a relationship with someone than burn them, especially if they're not in a powerful position. If someone is talking to you about this is off the record, they're not media naive, right? They're media savvy. So let me just give you an example of a sort of payoff from sort of building credibility, watching a story for a while, reporting on it. There's this guy named Jatinder Ahluwalia. He's a former now. We haven't posted it, but we have a sort of unofficial list that Adam and I keep of people who've lost their jobs since we started writing about them. We are very careful. Adam and I understand the difference between cause-effect and correlation, but there are facts about the fact that we've written about them and they've now lost their jobs. So this is a guy who, long story short, there was a retraction in Nature about a year and a couple months ago. And it was not particularly sketchy on details, but it referred to some information that was going to be online, supplemental information for this retraction, which actually wasn't online yet. So we followed up. It ended up not going online for about a month. It was through one of the universities in London where this guy had gotten he was a postdoc. And so it turned out he had sabotaged other people. This is, among the spectrum of misconduct. If sort of unintentional plagiarism's over here, sabotage is not even in the room, right? So that's pretty bad. So we found out that he was actually working at another university which he's now lost his job at after all this coverage. And so we found that out. We then started following the case, and one of our commenters left a note that says, hey, did you notice that Jatinder is actually now studying plagiarism? Like, that's his subject of interest. And we're like, really? Like, that seems worthy of ridicule. Because plagiarism was the one thing he hadn't done. If you looked at every other count of misconduct, it was the thing he hadn't done. So,
Jason Blair taught morals?
What's that?
Jason Blair taught morals.
Well, that's true. Jason Blair taught morals. It's a bit like that. So he's studying it, and he publishes a paper, et cetera, et cetera. So people saw that we were following this case as closely as anyone. In fact, we're the only people really on it. So this post came out of an email that we got one day from someone who, we're protecting. He's an anonymous source. But he said, you should look at the 2 PDFs that are attached to this email. I open up the PDFs, and I get, this is one of the letters, which we then posted on the site. You don't have to read it in detail, but the first sentence kind of is damning enough. It turns out that this guy not only lost his job as a postdoc, but somehow ended up at this other university years and years before, and no one, including the place he actually got his graduate degree, knew this. Years and years before, he had been kicked out of Cambridge for having also sabotaged and done some fraudulent stuff with his research. Nobody knew this. And when you call universities with information like, hey, did you know that the guy you let in and that you've now hired has done this? That's kind of not a great time for that PR officer, usually. So, and by the way, just to say a little bit about process here. So, the tempting thing was, as soon as we got this letter, to run it. I mean, it looks legitimate, right? I mean, it turns out to be legitimate. But let's say you just saw this. I think we're all pretty savvy enough now to know that I could have done that this morning. Even me with my really limited graphic design skills. So what I did, of course, was I called Dr. Brand, who's now actually in La Jolla or somewhere out in San Diego, I think, and said, well, I have these letters. Did you actually write them? He was actually happy to hear from me. He said, I've been trying to get this guy out of science for a decade. I hope this does it. Well, but you do have to verify stuff, even if it looks totally legit. You can't just run with it. But once I verified it, I was, of course, happy to run with it. Another sort of, a little bit of a tip. Nowadays, because of time shifting, and because sometimes it's just easier to have a sort of solid thing to put into a post, it's very tempting, and I will admit I frequently do it, to do a lot of stuff by email. To go and just say, okay, here, can I ask you this? And for a lot of things, to be honest, that works. I don't think it's the first choice, but there are other times when phone is definitely better. And I'll just fast forward you to this one. Some of you may be familiar with this story. Eric Vance is a freelancer who got denied a press pass by the American Cetacean Society. Those are the whale folks. Whale Society has a particular interest in its own conference and what have you. And I called, this is from Bargo Watch, obviously, I called the executive director. This is actually a quote first. This is an email from Eric. But then I called the executive director of the society because I couldn't believe what she had told Eric. It was so beyond the pale. It was literally, we're in a sort of business transaction. You're not offering me any value. I'm not going to give you access to this conference, which just isn't what you say to reporters. That's not how it works. I actually still have her voicemail. I couldn't figure out how to play it, on my phone because it's in my Verizon voicemail, what have you. But I transcribed it, which I'm sure she was thrilled to see on the site. But she actually said all the things he said. She totally verified it. Had I sent her an email, she very well could have ignored it. Or she could have sort of written back something very carefully lawyered and what have you. But this is gold. I mean, this is absolute gold. It goes on and on. I won't take your time with it, but hopefully you trust me that that's gold. But ditto with that, sort of going alongside that. you do much better when you actually go with evidence that you have. If you ask people sort of open-ended questions, have you ever done anything wrong? Yes. Have you ever done anything wrong that ended, that landed you in prison? That's a more specific kind of question, which we often actually ask certain kinds of people. But go with very specific evidence. Some of you, this is a very recent thing that was obviously on my mind as I was preparing for this. David Sinclair, backstory, Deepak Das is at this point really was a sort of resveratrol researcher in Yukon, Connecticut, who the university announced they found him guilty of 145 counts of fraud, misconduct, manipulating images, all the sorts of things you're not supposed to do. So, and we wrote about that, and other people wrote about that, and we kept following it up. But one of the things and Adam and I had this sort of regular breakfast meeting that we get together, and that meeting was in the middle of some of these, in the days that this was running. And one of the things that bugged us, there's a New York Times story that actually quoted Adam about this. And it also quoted David Sinclair, whose name some of you may know. He's a big resveratrol researcher, co-founded Certrus, I guess. Sold Certrus, excuse me, for a couple dollars, or no wait, that was $720 million. And, it's been a big, he used to get up at conferences and hand out resveratrol, and then hand out red wine, I guess, at the bar. But he actually told the Department of Higher Education this too, that he had to look up who Das was, had never heard of him. Well, that's what's known as a verifiable fact. Adam and I like verifiable facts, especially when we can verify that they're not actually facts. So what we did was, I said, well, what we should do is just look through all of the papers he's ever cited and see whether he cited them. And I said, I don't have time for that. I actually have a day job, and so does Adam. But we hunted around enough to find that the two of them had been on a committee together, on a resveratrol scientific committee for a conference about a year and a half ago. That sort of suggested maybe they didn't know each other. In fact, it meant they did know each other. So this I did by email because Sinclair he's hard to reach. He's hard to reach for certain things. Let's just put it that way. And I wasn't quite sure I'd hear back from him. I wasn't sure what I would do if I didn't hear back from him with this. But he actually just sent me this email. And I laid out the facts to him. I said, you said this to the Times and to the Chronicle. But we have this committee that you're on. Can you clarify what exactly is the case? And that's what he wrote. That's the whole thing. That's all he wrote. That was also gold in a different way. He's actually, again, he and the Well Society person were being equally transparent once something bad happened. But, being called out on lying in the New York Times is generally not, Jason Blair, of course, did it a little bit on a much more grander scale. But again, we went to him with facts. As it turned out, and this is a sort of another reminder of where to find those facts, it turns out, and we have a number of commenters. Some of you maybe are commenters, and we don't know who a lot of those folks are. They're anonymous, and we're happy that way. But one of our commenters actually went and looked enough of his papers to find 2 times that Sinclair had actually cited Das. So that was the evidence we were actually looking for to begin with, and so we of course updated it. So look to your commenters and others for sourcing.
I just have a question in the context of what you're talking about in terms of credibility. Mm-hmm. So you made a comment about the fact that sometimes you're better off, if you can, get them on the phone versus an email, right? If you're talking to someone on the phone who doesn't want to be recorded, so you don't necessarily have a record of that. You have a record with an email, so it's almost, it seems to me like that would be more credible. So can you speak to that?
Well, yeah, I think Liz, you're raising a really important point. I mean, credibility, I guess I'm talking about credibility going into the interview, and then this is sort of credibility coming out of it. No, you're absolutely right. If you can get the person on email to say what he said, well, that's clear and easy, and you're done. Often you can't do that. You actually have a much better chance of getting the person on the phone. And that's what I was getting at. I don't actually record interviews. Haven't since college. It just takes me so long to, if I have something I know I want to use, I, say to the person, okay, let me make sure I got this right. But, and then I don't want to get into long discussion about recording and what have you. I know people have different, very smart opinions on that, different from mine. But I don't actually record, and I've never been asked, and no one's ever suggested I misquote her, and even when it's something damning like that. But that was
Just your chances of getting gold are like much higher in person or on a phone. When you give them the leisure of thinking through what you asked them and responding to.
And then they're going to
And when
read
you
that.
look at somebody in the eye, and they don't like you as much either.
Right.
Not to make a big thing of it, but if you do record and you do record on the phone, there are places you can go to see whether or not that's legal. Sometimes, depending on which jurisdiction you are in, you can or cannot, it may or may not be legal to record, a phone conversation.
Well,
And
I
they're all
wouldn't
under-
record without telling the source first anyway.
Well, it's always legal if you tell them, it's always legal.
If you ask them,
Yeah.
I'm recording this, and they say no. But again, I'm not saying that's an important detail, but and I think it's certainly a conversation to have. And maybe people are having it on Twitter as we speak, which is great. But I'm looking at the clock now and realizing that I want to make sure to get to the FOIA stuff. I could talk all day about all these examples, but let me sort of move on to FOIA a little bit, just what Charles was going to talk about.
I just have one question. You mentioned right off the top that having some clout and some people know who you are, they trust you. Now, with something like Retraction Watch or Embargo Watch, you and Adam Marcus going into it had that weight behind you for people to trust you with things. How would you go into it if you were new? Like, if you were just starting out as a journalism career, you know that's sort of the path you want to get to, where would you go? What's the path?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think, Adam and I, right, we didn't come at this completely de novo, and I hope I didn't leave that impression. I mean, I'm always very clear that, what I do at Retraction Watch is completely separate from what I do at Reuters. On the other hand, I have to disclose that I'm at Reuters when I talk to anybody. So, Reuters is just if you have, I know most of you probably haven't heard of it. It's this little news agency, been around for something 160 years. So I know that. Like, and Adam, similarly, he's at a trade club, but a very well-respected one that everyone in his field knows. You just kind of have to start. I guess that's a silly way to answer, but maybe you start by hooking up with someone else who has that credibility. And didn't come here to pitch this, but we love guest posts, for example. We've got a guy, Miko Tatalovic, who some of you may know, he's in the UK, has written a couple of great posts for us on sort of Balkan retractions. It's sort of funny to say Balkanized retraction. I don't know, but they're actually from the Balkans. And we don't have access to that literature. Even if we did, we couldn't read it, because I barely read English, let alone Croatian and Serbian. So, we love that. So that's one way to do it, not the only way to do it. But if you drill at something, and you're cautious at the beginning, but start to really build, you will build an audience. I mean, this is not a conference I have to make that case. I mean, you guys know how powerful blogging is, and how, and the blogs, I should give credit to the fact that my blogs came out of this conference. They were inspired, not the subject matter so much, but the fact that so people were having so much of an impact with blogs. And so I think you can start with that, and sometimes what happens is you're not driving, it's going tangentially at something. So it's not that you're driving at this like, I want to have like this investigative blog. You're writing about something, and someone who trusts you because you're writing about whales, okay, says to you, and by the way, you might be interested in this thing. That happens far more often, I think, than people think about. And so if you're developing sources for whatever reason, they're going to trust you with that. All of a sudden you have a great story. There's a guy named Brendan Burrell. I think some of you probably know Brendan. Brendan and I are good friends, but we met because he started pitching me at The Scientist when I was there, and ended up writing his very first piece out of the box was a fantastic piece about this fraudster. And so now I'm in a slightly different position, but he became my go-to guy when it came to sort of stuff that looked like fraud and usually turned out to be fraud. He has PTSD, unfortunately, because of one particular story that he did for me. He doesn't actually have PTSD, and I don't mean to make light of PTSD, but he certainly has. He doesn't like thinking about it, let's put it that way. It involved a bioethicist named Glenn McGee, if you know who that is. Okay, let me just move on to FOIA, because this is a sort of more formal aspect of things. And I want to give credit specifically to the people who specifically helped me with this, because I have filed FOIAs. I have supervised people in filing FOIAs, but it's not something I do regularly. So I wanted to tap into the hive mind a bit of my colleagues, mostly at the AHCJ and IRE, Association of Healthcare Journalists. So I have actually a document here. Not that I FOIA. No, I have a document here that I just asked Charlie Ornstein for. Charlie's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, now at ProPublica in New York. He was at the LA Times many years before that. And first, I think it's important to just start with what on earth. How many? Well, show of hands. How many of you have ever filed a FOIA? Okay, so a good number. So those of you, you can zone out, maybe even more than you're already zoning out if you're already zoning out for the sort of basics here. But actually, you can just actually help me sort of walk through this. It's important to know what you can actually request. This varies by jurisdiction and what have you. But there are federal laws about FOIA, and there are state laws about FOIA. They vary. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press actually has a website, which again, this is all on the wiki. This is looking ugly, but sorry, this is not sized properly. But they actually, FOIA letter generator, which is sort of, I guess, like one of those fake. It's not actually, but you can just plug in, the information you need and what have you. So that's Charlie's first tip is, you're entitled to request records from public agencies, federal, state, county, or city level, and there are laws about these things. FOIA is actually an act. It's not just a sort of nice thing that agencies do for you. If you don't know what records, and by the way, just because it sounds like a record that you should have the rights to, doesn't mean that the agency actually holds on to that record for any amount of time. So if you don't know what records an agency keeps, start with what's called the records retention policy or the document retention policy, and look at actually what the agency might have. Your first instinct, according to again Charlie, is that it shouldn't to automatically file a FOIA. This isn't sort of doing the howitzer approach to investigative journalism. Number one, it'll take you forever. And number two, you probably won't get what you want. And number three, it'll more than likely tell the entire world what you're working on, which actually isn't necessarily in your best interest. Because your sources, your sort of targets, if you will, can find that out as well. We all know how to search online. That's sort of obvious. A lot of stuff is actually available, and sometimes you'll call the FOIA officer and they'll say, "Oh, well, here's the link. We can both save ourselves a lot of time. Let's do this." And by the way, this is mostly familiar here with the U.S. and with jurisdictions in the U.S. The UK and Canada have pretty similar. They're not the same, but they're sort of more or less similar in broad strokes, but they are different. So keep that in mind. I will say though, and I want to sort of give a couple points of view here. Charles Duhigg, the other Charlie, he takes a little different approach, and he says, have a big net, right? File everything. Send a letter, because FOIA letters are so easy to generate. Just send one to everyone who might possibly have that information. Again, by the way, you don't need a lawyer to write this letter. The Reporters Committee actually knows what they're doing. You can just use that and tweak it as you need. So he says, just, send it out. And because his eventual goal, he take again a different approach from Charlie. His eventual goal is he wants to get someone on the phone who's exasperated at him. Most investigative reporters actually like it, by the way, when they get people exasperated. It means they're getting somewhere. Who says to him, your requests are just ridiculous. They're going to take millions of pages and you're not going to find what you want. You know what you actually want? Oh, okay. And then you write a letter for that, and then that person's probably already pulled the file. He or she gets the letter. Boom, you're done, and you've got your story. So, and again, by the way, I should back up. Yes, reporters probably file more FOIAs than the rest of the universe on, per capita. But many, many FOIA requests are filed by the public. Any member of the public can file one. This was not a law written for reporters. The only difference is often agencies will prioritize journalists' FOIA requests, often because they put, sentences in their letter, which you can do too, saying, here's the reason why for example, you should expedite this, it's in the public interest. And you can, in all honesty, you can probably make a better case for that if you're at a big newspaper or, news outlet than if you are Joe Public. But why not be Joe Public and hook up with the big news? I mean, if you've got a great story, especially nowadays, why not hook up with a big, outlet that might actually help you along? You should.
So I'm a total dilettante, and somebody sent me a huge PDF of a bunch of FOIA stuff that had wound up on governmentattic.org. And I'm mystified. I mean, it was gold, and I'm grateful for it. But how did that happen? What is that about?
Without knowing, obviously, the specific case, why is it on that site?
Yeah.
Probably someone FOIA'd it. Didn't, and again, anyone can. Using FOIA as a verb is sort of funny, but and then you can do whatever you want with it. I mean, they're supposed to have given it out. That's why they gave it out. Is that what you mean?
So the recipient said, "I'm just going to put this online."
Do whatever he or she wants.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then they also have these FOIA logs.
Right, actually, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I might as well just talk about FOIA logs. So you can actually, the ACJ periodically does this. You can FOIA the FOIA log if you want to get really meta. The reason we occasionally do that is we want to see how long FOIAs take, and which is a good reason to bring up this. Be patient, right? How patient are you? I ask here. That you guys, if you didn't know who Clinton was, going back a little bit. 8 federal agencies have FOIA requests a decade old. And Scott, you may be familiar with some of this Knight stuff. But, that's not necessarily typical, but 8 agencies is a lot of agencies. You sometimes have to be quite persistent, quite patient, but also you have to sometimes have a little bit of money, which is why it might be a good idea to sometimes partner with someone who's willing to spend a little bit. Agencies are allowed by law to charge you per page, even in an electronic age, because a lot of these records, to be honest, are not available electronically. They may charge you a nickel a page, they may charge you 50 cents a page. You can imagine, and it's not hard, by the way, to end up with a set of documents that's thousands of pages, or even literally hundreds of thousands of pages. Even at a penny or a nickel a page, that's going to add up. You can actually try and argue, and sometimes be successful, and you can actually appeal these if you're not successful. You can argue that there is, again, a public interest, need for this to be out in the public, and that you would have a hardship that would keep you from, actually doing anything with this if you had to pay that. Now, sometimes, when there were a couple of cases where we FOIA'd stuff at the scientist, and it was on the order of a few $100. Well, I just said, rather than try and argue it and give them 6 more months to mess with my head, I'm going to write them a check for $300 and use it. That was, I think, USDA that we were dealing with at that time. The other thing, and this sort of gets to the difference of opinion, or the difference in approach between Charles and the 2 Charleses, is that this doesn't actually have to be adversarial, right? So both Charleses, I feel silly saying that, but I want to give credit to people, say, again, you want to get to that point where someone tells you what they actually need, where they're sympathetic with you. Maybe they're exasperated. But one of the ways to do that is to have conversations with, and each agency is going to have a FOIA ombudsperson or a FOIA officer, and say, look, I'm as much against bureaucracy as you are. It's all those people making those decisions. You want this information out, I want it out. Let's sort of work together on this.
Sure. So is how long a FOIA takes, are there any generalizations that can be made? Certain agencies that are known to take forever, it's a function of incompetence or who's running the show?
Right. That's a great question. Basically, all the agencies take forever. If you start with that assumption. But the other assumption you have to start with, this is, going back to something I was saying to someone, I remember earlier today, but, what's the quote? Never ascribe bad intent when it's just incompetence. So it's somewhere usually between, bad intent and incompetence. To be fair, sometimes you're asking for a lot. I mean, and I'm not defending any of the agencies. One thing that did start to happen, and seems to have stopped, is that agencies would literally say, yeah, I have that, but I'm going to make you FOIA it. I used to get that from NIH a lot. I'd be like, really? I mean, is that... Because I'm going to put that in the story, by the way, too. The fact that you said this is a public document, and that you could give it to me, but you're going to make me FOIA it. Sometimes that actually works. When you have a rational discussion with people, I don't know if that's a threat, it's a promise. I would put it in the story. I usually try and be transparent like that. It sometimes helps, but they're all kind of bad. But I will say that from my not so much my experience, but just talking to other people, some of the state agencies, some of the very small state agencies are actually better. And that's one of the things that one of my colleagues, Felice Fryer, actually suggested. She said, think about other agencies that might have what you want. For example, you can FOIA the CDC for your statistics. But if you're in a place and you care about the county level or even the state level, well, all that, CDC doesn't do, I mean, and Marin is here, so she will, I hope, correct me if anything I'm getting wrong. Of course, they do their own research and they get their own data, but the vast majority, or at least a lot of their stuff, has to come up through public agencies at city and state level. Well, those city and state level agencies are FOIAble. I'm using it as some sort of weird adjective. You can FOIA those agencies. They're subject to the same laws. And it might be faster. Again, that's not going to help you if you really need a national picture. But if you really care about North Carolina and what's happening, then you might be able to do it that way.
How long do you typically wait before following up on a request?
So that's a great question. And the question is, how long do you usually wait? There are actually statutes. So what they don't have to give you, they have to answer you in a certain amount of time. And it varies by state, city, etc. You can look all that up but generally, I think most of them are about 30 days that they have to answer you, not with the documents, but to say, we have received your letter, right? If they don't do that, then there's, I don't know if it's a penalty or you can appeal or what have you, but that's the starting point. Then there's another point at which, and again, it varies by what agency. But there's a point at which they have to tell you, here's what we have, and here's what we can get you, and here's how much it'll cost, or here's how long it'll take. All of that stuff. And again, that varies. But if anyone has done a lot of FOIA, you can offer. Yeah.
What we started doing pretty routinely, an investigative reporter friend of mine brought me onto this approach, is on your initial contact, especially with the FOIA officers that you're going to be dealing with, and you know that they're going to be kind of amenable to the cooperative approach. So your initial contact, say, and if there's any way we can recraft this to narrow it down to what I'm really looking for, let me know immediately, and I will resubmit asking for that. And let's get the conversation going or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. That gets back to this, idea. That's good advice and very specific in terms of it doesn't have to be adversarial, and if it is adversarial, it doesn't have to be 100% adversarial. It can be these are public servants.
I wanted to loop back to what you said about a FOIA letting other people know what you're working on. So I don't do a lot of FOIA work now, but when I was at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, we did it routinely. And one of the things that we always filed was, this was largely with regard to the CDC and HHS, we periodically filed FOIAs in which we asked for notification of all the other FOIAs that the CDC can ask for. And as soon as something is FOIA'd, to make it a verb, it becomes a public document. In other words, the FOIA request itself is a public document. So if you are doing any kind of investigative work that you don't want anyone to know about, doing the FOIA early on is like a big red flag on what you're doing.
Yeah, and I mentioned, I think before you came in, that we've actually wrestled with it. Marin's on the board of the ACJ with me. And we've wrestled with this because one of the things we want to know is how long agencies are taking. But if we also don't want to jeopardize all of our colleagues' work because we would have a whole record of what everyone is working on, which doesn't totally seem fair, although it's legal.
Is there a way to make the request so that you get the information you want without revealing what you really want? I mean, to ask it broadly enough that it's not clear what you're working on?
The request, yeah, you can always. I mean, it's a bit of a. I don't know if it's catch-22 exactly, but it's a balance. So if you ask such a broad request that no other reporter is going to be able to figure out what you're interested in, there's a really good chance that the agency isn't going to figure out what you actually need. So the request itself, can be as broad as you want, but whether you'll get what you need, that's going to be the tension there. Charles wanted to, Charles Duhigg, this is, just sort of share that every interview he ever does, whether it's with a FOIA officer, whether it's with a source, whether it's with anyone, always ends with two questions. There are a series of questions, but they sort of group into two. One is, and again, these are somewhat obvious, but worth mentioning. One is, what should I have asked? What didn't I ask you that I've asked? That, by the way, goes for when you're reporting about anything, investigations or not. The other is, who else should I have spoken to? Again, goes for anything that you're talking to, and I'm sure most of you already do that, or at their reporting. And he goes a step further and says, can you let that person know that I'll be calling? Because that way it's not a cold call, and then hopefully you get sort of bumped up on the list of calls that person has to return that day. Again, I won't sort of click through all of these, but this is just go to the wiki, and I can maybe publish this in a place that's a little easier to find, or keep adding to it. But there's something called muckrock.org. Which will actually do this for you. So I talked earlier about maybe partnering with an organization. If there are costs involved, Muckrock isn't necessarily going to pick those up. But if you want sort of help doing this between the Reporters Committee and Freedom of the Press, Muckrock, there are other resources and other organizations.
Who's behind it? IRA or?
No, it's I think these are. This came from, I think, Felice telling about this. Let me just see who these guys are. Michael Morrissey, award-winning journalist, co-founder, Mitchell. So those guys. Yeah. Whether funded and how they're funded, those look like kind of people who wouldn't take funding, but you always want to kick the tires a little bit. Other questions, other sort of suggestions from other people. I've sort of talked for a while. But.
One way I've heard to get around the cost sometimes is just suggesting you another reporter is instead of asking for the documents, ask for access to the documents.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that just means they'll put it in the room and you have to go sit through it for 3 days. But if you're worried about $300 worth of and $5 on the documents, that's one way to get around it.
You have to do the calculation of how much your time is worth, of course, but absolutely no. And sometimes, even not FOIA stuff, agencies, when they're about to announce something, will put you in a room put all reporters in a room like this and give it to you under embargo, and you can't photocopy it. You can sort of scribble whatever you can scribble in like half an hour. Wire service reporters tend to do pretty well with this stuff. And then, then the embargo lifts and you have it. Some other issues with that, which are not particularly relevant here, but usually.
So again, this is another sort of journalism 101 question, and that is, I've experienced this both in the private sector and with agencies like FDA, where any contact with somebody who actually knows something is immediately shunted to PR, and that leads to this essentially worthless exchange of me asking questions and getting just non-answers.
So the question is how to avoid that?
Yeah.
And again, I think there's a long-range response to that, which is to realize you have to develop relationships with those key people. Even figuring out who those people are, though, is not necessarily an easy task. So that's number one. One thing I'll say is that this isn't quite as true as it used to be, but certain agencies actually will respond more quickly or kick you up the ladder to the non-PR person more quickly if you either sound like or actually say that you are from a trade publication. In other words, if you're not from, the top 3 newspapers, the top 3 magazines, what have you, top 3 broadcast networks, you will actually bump up above a lot of regional newspapers, what have you. I'm not condoning this, by the way. I'm just saying this is what happens. If you are from a trade publication. So, for example, when I used to write for the Lancet years and years ago, and when I would call about to try and get comments here from the FDA about a new policy or something I needed, and a friend of mine from another paper would actually have these races, and I would always get the call back first. So I'm not saying fake it, certainly. I mean, be honest about what you're doing, but take advantage of the fact if you are writing for a specialized audience, particularly in health, because the FDA has a real, focus on getting information out to healthcare professionals. That's one way to think about it. But building a relationship, thinking about who your audience is and what the interests of the agency are. But also, I know schmoozing is sort of looked down upon in many circles at this point, but go to the conferences where those people are. Like, those people actually are out there. In fact, a lot of their schedules are public. They have to be. This is very senior officials. And those aren't necessarily the ones you need either, because they're pretty lawyered up and polished. But, go to the conferences where the head of whatever, unit at the FDA, or, not the director of an institute at NIH, but someone a couple rungs down, go to those conferences. They're going to be presenting. They'll be standing here like this, and, the worst case scenario is you get I'm not allowed to talk about that, which usually is pretty helpful for a story too, actually.
Are there agencies that are like un-FOIA-able? Like if I try to start FOIAing like DARPA, and I'm like, sorry, national security.
That's a really good question. I mean, what'll happen is, every agency is FOIA-able. Again, the regulations vary a little bit by agency, but what might happen is they'll just say they're allowed to use the national security trump card. That doesn't mean that they're right. It doesn't mean that you can't appeal that. And then once you start having to deal with appeals of FOIA and national security, you're going to have to get some help, obviously, from people with JDs and lots of money to roll around in. But news agencies, news organizations will do that if they feel it's important. Canada has a weird thing where, can't help it, I'm tired, sorry. No, but Canada, and actually Margaret Munro, who's a terrific reporter for Canada, for Post Media, she had this document, it was actually one of the examples I was giving, where she got a heavily redacted document from NSERC, which, correct me here, Colin, but it's more or less the NSF of Canada, something like that, federal agency that funds research. And it was about a couple fraud cases, and it was so heavily redacted that you couldn't make heads or tails of it. She then, anyway, long story short, I figured out who the person was after she gave me a couple bits of information, but she did the heavy lifting. But they actually changed that policy, NSERC, so they now don't redact that because of the pressure after her story. So sometimes you can actually just do that. Now, the difference between NSERC and the State Department is going to be a little bit, you can't simply FOIA. Okay, I need all troop movements in Afghanistan for the next month. You can go for it, and if you get it, you're a winner. But you also have to judge whether that's something that you're going to do much with.
I just want to make a comment about public information officers, because the general attitude of journalists is that they're obstructionist. And I have worked on both sides of the fence, and I would say that most of the people that I've worked with in public information positions had journalism degrees or came from a journalism background before they became public information people, and subscribe to the same belief set, basically, that it's public information and they have a right to it. And so they are kind of in a difficult position a lot of times where they're having to balance maybe pressure from someone else higher up in the organization who may not want to share information, but a lot of times they're on the journalist's side, and developing relationships with those people can be worth your time. It's not really great practice to blanketly say, this is not worth pursuing this, and where we want to always avoid these folks, because they can sometimes get you information you don't even know to ask for. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, and I think I would actually agree. I mean, I think, you give everyone the benefit of the doubt, and again, a lot of PIOs and people in similar positions have been very helpful to me. Their names aren't going to appear, and quite frankly, they don't want their bosses to know they're helping me, and that's just fine with me. I got the information I needed, and I proved, what I was trying to prove. So that's fine. I think, the question is, once someone proves they're obstructionist, I'm going to do everything I can do to never deal with them again.
Right.
So, I saw a hand over here, I think. Chris.
So, maybe this was the first portion of the session that I missed, but, as somebody who's never been in a context where people were doing, really hard-nosed investigative journalism, it's hard for me to know what I would want to avoid. In other words, where do you even start? Because this is something that I really want to do more of. It's really hard to know even how to take baby steps.
I think that's great, and I think it's a great question, and I sort of going back a little bit to what I said to Colin's unrelated question, how do you develop credibility? I think, I'm a big fan of, again, developing relationships across the spectrum and working and just apprenticing yourself to people, informally or formally. A lot of people come to me with story ideas, not necessarily that I'm going to do anything with, but just they want advice on, and I'm happy to give it, and I hope it's decent advice. I think that finding people who are looking at the kinds of questions you're looking at, and just seeing what they've done in the past, but just asking them, I think nowadays is, pretty useful. Charlie, of course, couldn't be here today, but is very approachable and happy to talk to people. People who come and talk about how to do stuff, generally respond to questions like that. But also, if you go to a lot of the sites I've talked about, it at least gives you an idea of what kinds of things other people have FOIA'd in the past and where they've gotten with them. So that you know that certain information you might not even have to FOIA, or other information is very difficult to get. Individual records, for example, are going to be more difficult to get than sort of aggregate, epidemiology data and statistics and things like that. So I want to be mindful of time because it's 3:45 according to that clock. Thank you all for your attention and questions. The wiki will obviously stay up, and I'll maybe put it somewhere else that's easy to find. I'm always findable on Twitter and all of those things, and obviously here. So hopefully this was a